Imagine freezing in a medieval winter so cold it could kill you in minutes. Now imagine the only thing that could keep you alive was burning poop. Yes, human and animal waste wasn't just a disgusting byproduct, it was life itself. Stay with us, because what these peasants did to survive will shock you, and it's stranger than anything you've ever heard. The winter that would not end. Imagine a winter so cruel that even the trees seem to shiver under its weight. The air bites at your skin, and your breath hangs frozen in the stillness like tiny ghosts. In the northern reaches of medieval Europe, such winters were not tales of fiction, they were daily battles for survival. Marin shivered as she peered through the tiny, frost-covered window of her hut. The landscape outside was a blank canvas of white, stretching as far as the eye could see. Each gust of wind carried sharp icicles that stung the exposed skin of any soul daring to step outside. Smoke spiraled from neighboring huts, each one desperately clinging to the warmth of whatever could be burned. Inside her family's hut, the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning cow dung. Marin wrinkled her nose, but the heat it provided kept the creeping cold from seizing her bones. Her father, Johann, stooped over the small hearth, dropping another clump of dried manure into the fire. "Keep it burning, Marin," he urged. "The cold takes nothing lightly." Marin nodded, carefully poking at the embers with a long stick. She had grown up knowing the pungent smell was part of survival. During summers, dung was collected from the barn and the fields, dried carefully on racks near the walls, and saved for this, weeks of relentless frost when firewood ran scarce. The villagers whispered about the winters that came before, the ones that killed without mercy. They spoke of frostbite, of families trapped in huts with nothing but snow pressing against their doors. It was during those winters that the humble piles of dung became more valuable than gold. "Why not just burn wood?" Marin asked, curiosity tinged with horror. Johann sighed, his breath a cloud of smoke. "Wood is scarce, child. The forest is far, and wolves roam where men cannot tread. What we have left must last until spring. The dung burns longer, hotter, and it is ours." Marin leaned closer to the fire. The flames danced orange and yellow, licking the dark corners of the hut. She could hear her mother humming softly as she wrapped Marin's younger brother in layers of tattered blankets. The fire crackled, a fragile guardian against the storm outside. It was a strange, almost surreal existence. Life had narrowed to the essentials: warmth, food, and the stubborn will to survive. Meals were simple, thin porridge made from oats or barley, sometimes flavored with a bit of preserved meat, but even that was a rarity this year. The snow had buried most of the fields, and the livestock had to be rationed carefully. Even the village priest had warned of divine wrath, claiming such winters were punishment for human sin. Yet in the hearts of the villagers, they knew survival was neither holy nor glamorous. It was practical, grim, and sometimes revolting. They burned what others would consider refuse because it carried them through nights of bitter frost, through the -30°F winds that threatened to steal their lives. As the night deepened, the storm outside grew fiercer. Marin's hut shook under the wind's assault. The small flames from the burning dung cast flickering shadows that danced across the walls, shadows that seemed almost alive. Every crack in the wooden walls, every gap in the roof, let in a whisper of the merciless cold. Marin hugged herself tighter, staring into the fire. She thought about the years before, when winters were harsh but not quite this unrelenting. She thought about her friends in neighboring villages, some of whom would not see another dawn. And she thought, with a mix of awe and horror, about the strange ingenuity of her people, how survival sometimes demanded acts no one would ever speak of outside the snowbound village. Outside, the snow continued its silent siege. Inside, Marin and her family sat close to the fire, the warmth of the burning dung a lifeline against a world frozen solid. This was life in the grip of the Little Ice Age, a life where even the most unthinkable sources of heat became sacred, where each night survived was a victory against nature itself. And in that fragile circle of light and warmth, Marin began to understand something essential: survival was never pretty, but it was fiercely human. The fuel of survival. The morning light crept reluctantly over the snow-covered village, a pale, gray smear behind the icy haze. Marin stepped outside, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. Her cheeks stung, her nose tingling from the sharp bite of the air. Around her, the village seemed caught in a perpetual fog of frost and smoke. Thin spirals of heat rose from every hut, each one powered not by wood or coal, but by the pungent fuel that defined survival: dried animal dung. Johann was already at the barn, wrapped in layers of wool, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Marin! Bring the baskets," he called. She hurried to him, glancing nervously at the frozen landscape beyond the village. Wolves were known to roam the outskirts, hungry and bold. Stepping into the forest was a dangerous gamble, but the dung in the fields would not collect itself. In the barnyard, the cows shifted restlessly, their breaths forming clouds of steam. Marin and her father began the laborious task of scooping the dried manure from the previous week's collection. It was hard, thankless work, but each small clump was a lifeline. The villagers had learned that freshly deposited dung would not burn well; it had to be dried, compacted, and stored for months before it could serve as fuel. As Marin worked, she thought of her mother's instructions: "Keep it dry, child. The heat you need to survive is hidden inside this humble pile. It may smell foul, but it is fire itself." By mid-morning, they had filled baskets with the carefully dried dung. The next step was shaping it into small cakes, flattened and compacted so that they would burn steadily on the hearth. This process required precision: too thick, and it would smolder and smoke excessively; too thin, and it would burn too quickly, wasting precious heat. The village healer, old Magda, often walked among the workers during these preparations. She muttered about tradition and survival, explaining to Marin why this practice had endured for centuries. Before the great winters, humans relied on what the forest and animals left behind, she said, her voice raspy from age. Dung, peat, even twigs. The wise know what can save them when the world turns white and bitter. Marin observed the other villagers as they worked. Some turned their noses from the stench, others grinned with grim humor. Children were taught to respect the dung as fuel, the fire that carries us through death, Magda called it. No one spoke of it lightly; it was both shameful and sacred, the paradox of survival in a frozen land. Back in the hut, the hearth was stoked with the new supply. Johann carefully laid the cakes of dried dung across the embers. They hissed, cracked, and flared, sending bursts of heat into the small room. The smell was potent, but Marin had grown used to it. The family gathered close, letting the warmth seep into their frozen limbs. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering. Villagers ventured out in small groups, carrying their carefully prepared dung cakes to neighbors whose fires had gone out. The sense of community was as crucial as the fuel itself. In winters like this, isolation was death. People shared knowledge, shared warmth, and even shared the most unglamorous forms of survival. As the day wore on, Marin's mind wandered to the strange ingenuity of her ancestors. Who would have thought that something discarded and reviled could be transformed into the very source of life itself? The dung that had once fertilized the fields now protected her family from the relentless cold. Every meal, every fire, every night survived was a testament to human adaptability, ingenuity, and the unyielding will to live. By evening, the hut glowed with a steady, orange warmth. The wind outside howled as if mocking the small, fragile flames, but inside, Marin's family was alive. For now, they had beaten the cold, if only temporarily. And in that fleeting triumph, she understood a truth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Survival often demanded sacrifices of dignity, endurance of discomfort, and the courage to embrace the unthinkable. That night, as Marin drifted into a weary sleep, the fire crackled, the scent of burning dung filling the air. Each ember was a heartbeat against the winter's fury, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life, messy, smelly, and miraculous, persisted. The edge of survival. The wind outside had become a living thing, shrieking across the frozen plains like a chorus of ghosts. Marin awoke before dawn, her body stiff and aching from the cold that seeped through the thin layers of blankets. She rubbed her hands together, feeling the sting of frostbite already creeping into her fingers. The fire in the hearth had burned low overnight, leaving only a stubborn glow from the last burning dung cakes. Her father stirred beside her. "We need more fuel," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, the result of the cold and weeks of rationed food. Johann had been up all night, moving between the hearth and the small store of dried dung cakes, ensuring the fire never died. Every ember was a fragile lifeline. Marin dressed quickly, layering woolen garments that were already stiff from the frost. Outside, the snow glimmered in the dim pre-dawn light, each flake a miniature knife against exposed skin. She shivered violently as she stepped outside to gather the morning supply of dung cakes from the barn. Her breath hung in the air like frozen smoke, and she could see the footprints of wolves and other scavenging animals pressed into the snow. Survival meant vigilance, danger lurked everywhere. The villagers worked silently, the grim routine of the winter having stripped words from them. Their hands, raw and cracked from cold and labor, moved with practiced precision. Each dung cake added to the fire was a heartbeat against the merciless winter. Marin watched neighbors dragging sleds laden with dried manure to distant huts, ensuring everyone had warmth. Even the children had roles, small, hardy legs carrying tiny bundles, learning early the price of life in such harsh conditions. Food was even scarcer than fire. The last of the preserved meat had been rationed weeks ago. Oats, barley, and root vegetables were stretched thin, boiled into watery porridge that barely satisfied hunger. Some villagers had taken to supplementing their meals by foraging under the snow, roots, frozen berries, even the occasional small animal trapped in the icy landscape. Hunger gnawed at the stomach like a relentless rodent, and yet the fear of frostbite was sharper. Marin's friend, Ansel, limped into the hut, his hands purple with cold and his feet swollen from frostbite. He had ventured too far from the village, hoping to scavenge firewood from a distant forest, only to find the wolves patrolling the edges. "The forest is death," he whispered hoarsely, collapsing near the fire. Johann gave him a handful of dried dung, urging him to stoke his own fire. It was all they could do: heat, rationed food, and hope. As the day wore on, Marin began to understand the full weight of winter survival. It was not enough to have fire, not enough to have food. Survival demanded ingenuity. She saw villagers experimenting: dung mixed with straw burned longer, cow patties pressed into small bricks for compact storage, even peat mixed into the dung to increase heat output. Each innovation was the product of desperation and necessity. At night, the cold became almost unbearable. The wind shrieked like a predator, and the snowdrifts pressed against the walls of the huts. Families huddled together, sharing body warmth and hope in equal measure. Each fire was tended with obsessive care. If it went out, death was only hours away. The pungent smell of burning dung filled every corner, a constant reminder of what life demanded. Marin realized something profound: this was not just survival. It was a test of the human spirit. Pride, vanity, and comfort had no place here. Only cunning, resilience, and a willingness to embrace the unthinkable could carry them through. To burn dung, to eat sparse porridge, to venture into storms, to share the last heat with neighbors, these were acts of courage disguised as necessity. By the end of the week, the village had found a rhythm. Fires burned steadily, rationed meals were stretched as far as possible, and even the children learned to respect the harsh rules of winter. Yet beneath the fragile triumph was a constant fear: one unexpected storm, one lapse in vigilance, and the cold would reclaim its victims without mercy. Marin sat by the hearth that evening, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the dung fire. She traced the small embers with her gaze, thinking about the strange cycle of life and survival: waste transformed into warmth, frost into opportunity, desperation into ingenuity. In this frozen world, humans had adapted in ways unthinkable to the modern mind. And for Marin, the realization was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The winter raged on, but within the tiny huts, amid the smell of burning dung and the murmur of hushed conversations, life persisted. It was a fragile, smelly, miraculous persistence, one ember at a time. Fire, faith, and folklore. The wind had eased slightly, but the village remained buried under a thick blanket of snow, the world outside a silent expanse of white. Inside the huts, the air was pungent with the ever-present aroma of burning dung, a smell that had become synonymous with life itself. Yet not everyone accepted it quietly. Elder Hildebrand, the village priest, shuffled into Marin's family hut, his robes dusted with snow. His face, lined with worry and devotion, betrayed a mixture of disapproval and concern. This cannot be holy," he muttered, wrinkling his nose at the fire. "To burn waste, to embrace filth, is it no sin?" Johann shook his head. "Father, sin does not freeze your fingers, nor does it thaw your children's toes. We do what we must to live. God gives us reason, He expects us to use it." Marin listened, fascinated. Even in the midst of deathly winters, the villagers wrestled with morality. Burning dung was practical, yes, but to some, it seemed a transgression against nature and divine order. Yet survival was harsh and demanded pragmatism over ritual. The villagers had their own superstitions, shaped by centuries of hardship. Some whispered that fires made from dung carried protective spirits, keeping evil forces at bay. Others swore that the smoke deterred winter demons, invisible creatures that brought frostbite and despair. Children were warned not to mock the stench, or the spirits would haunt their dreams. Marin's friend, Ansel, had been unusually quiet that day, staring into the fire as though seeking answers in the flickering flames. "Do you think the fire knows?" he asked finally, his voice trembling. "Do you think it chooses who survives?" Marin considered this. Survival often seemed random, yet the fire was their ally. Perhaps, in a world where snow buried hope, even a foul-smelling ember became sacred. The cultural weight of their practices extended to community rituals. When a new batch of dung was dried and stored, villagers held a small ceremony, a few whispered prayers, a symbolic sprinkle of water on the cakes, and the sharing of a small portion among neighbors. It was both practical and spiritual, a recognition that survival was communal, not individual. But superstition and culture could not shield them from hard realities. That week, a harsh blizzard trapped several villagers in a distant barn. When they finally returned, weak and frostbitten, the village realized just how fragile life could be. Marin helped carry the injured inside, laying them near the dung fires, whose heat had become more precious than ever. Inside the hut, Marin's mother murmured a prayer, not for salvation, but for strength and endurance. In the fire's glow, Marin saw her neighbors' faces, hardened by cold, but alive. She understood that morality and survival were entangled in ways no simple rule could explain. The world demanded ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to embrace the unthinkable. Even the children learned lessons of practical ethics. Stealing dung was theft, punishable by shaming and extra labor. Yet sharing, helping a frostbitten neighbor, or daring to venture into the snow to retrieve extra fuel was heroic. The lines between sin and necessity blurred in a frozen world where the alternative to survival was death. As night fell, the village gathered for a rare moment of warmth and solidarity. Fires burned in every hut, their pungent smoke rising into the frosty sky. Marin watched the flames dance, thinking of the paradox. What was reviled by some, the very waste of life, was the lifeblood of survival. They had turned human ingenuity into heat, fear into ritual, and desperation into a strange, almost sacred form of life. The winter was far from over. Storms would come again, hunger would gnaw, and frostbite would threaten their fingers and toes. Yet amidst the darkness, amidst the smell and discomfort, Marin found awe, humanity's capacity to adapt, endure, and even find meaning in the most unthinkable circumstances was nothing short of extraordinary. The fire crackled, shadows playing across the hut's walls. Outside, the storm whispered its menace. Inside, the villagers held their ground, guided by heat, hope, and the strange, indispensable power of burning dung. Triumph in the frost. The village had endured weeks of unrelenting cold, snow piling high against doors and windows, icicles hanging like jagged teeth from every roof. The wind screamed through the frozen fields, carrying with it the scent of ice and despair. Yet inside each hut, life clung stubbornly to existence, fueled by fires that burned human and animal waste, a pungent, vital lifeline. Marin stirred before dawn, noticing that the fire in their hearth had dwindled dangerously low. Her father, Johann, was already awake, inspecting the last of the stored dung cakes. "We have enough for the morning," he said, his voice weary but steady. "After that, we must gather more before the storm worsens." Outside, the blizzard had intensified. Snow whipped across the village like white knives, and visibility was almost zero. Even the hardiest villagers feared venturing out. Yet survival demanded courage. Marin wrapped herself in layers of wool and fur, clutching a basket of prepared dung cakes, and joined her father. The trek to the barn was treacherous. Snowdrifts reached above their knees, and hidden patches of ice threatened every step. Wolves prowled near the tree line, drawn by the faint smell of life. Ansel and a few other villagers had gone ahead, their silhouettes barely visible through the blinding snow. The group moved in silence, relying on instinct and a faint knowledge of the landscape. At the barn, the villagers discovered the harshest reality of the Little Ice Age: the cattle had suffered. Several were lost to frost and illness. Each life lost meant fewer dung cakes, fewer hearth fires, fewer embers to survive the next night. Grief mixed with fear, and yet there was no time to mourn extensively. Survival required immediate action. Marin and her friends set to work. They gathered the dried dung, mixed it carefully with straw, and pressed it into compact cakes. Every movement was precise, every clump saved could mean life or death. The smell was overwhelming, but the warmth it would generate was worth the discomfort. As they labored, a sudden cry split the wind. One of the younger children had fallen through a hidden snowdrift, trapped and terrified. Marin acted instinctively, digging through the icy trap to rescue him. Cold water seeped into her boots, chilling her toes, but the child was safe. Heroism, she realized, was often simple, practical action, doing whatever it took to keep another alive. Back in the huts, fires were stoked with renewed vigor. Smoke filled the rooms, pungent but life-giving. Families huddled close, sharing what little food remained and warming fingers and toes against the merciless frost. Even the villagers who had scorned dung as a fuel source now recognized its sacred practicality. Pride and disgust were luxuries none could afford. The following weeks tested the village further. Illness crept silently among them, the cold weakening bodies and lowering resistance. Yet, through it all, the fires burned. Marin witnessed neighbors nursing each other, sharing meager meals, and rotating the precious heat among the huts. Human ingenuity and solidarity were as vital as the dung in the hearth. By the end of the winter, the snow began to recede, leaving the village battered but alive. Houses bore the scars of ice and wind, livestock numbers had dwindled. And hunger had etched lines of fatigue across every face. But the villagers had endured. They had survived nights where death was a constant shadow, relying on ingenuity, courage, and the unthinkable act of burning what others would discard. Marin sat by the hearth one final time, the fire fueled by the last remaining dung cakes. She inhaled the pungent smoke, a reminder of the terrible winter they had conquered. Survival had demanded endurance, ingenuity, and a willingness to embrace discomfort and revulsion. In that quiet, post-storm moment, she realized something profound: the essence of humanity lies in its ability to adapt, endure, and find warmth, even in the most unlikely places. What had once seemed shameful, revolting, or desperate had become the emblem of life itself. The village emerged from the winter forever changed. Stories of the dung-fueled fires, of courage, ingenuity, and compassion, would echo for generations. The harsh winter had tested them, stripped them to essentials, and taught them that survival is never easy, never glamorous, but always a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as Marin watched the first green shoots of spring appear through the melting snow, she knew that life, in all its messiness and ingenuity, would always find a way. After the freeze, spring came slowly. The snow, once relentless, began to soften under the timid warmth of the sun. Icicles hung like crystal daggers along the eaves, dripping steadily into puddles that refused to vanish entirely. The village was battered, huts leaned under the weight of ice, livestock numbers had dwindled, and the earth smelled faintly of thawing decay. Yet the villagers were alive. Marin walked through the streets, marveling at how the community had endured. Children stumbled over uneven snowbanks, their laughter fragile yet persistent. Adults carried buckets of water from melting streams, repaired huts, and checked on neighbors. Every face bore the exhaustion of the long winter, yet there was a glimmer of pride, even triumph. The fires, pungent with dung for months, were now replaced with wood, harvested carefully from nearby forests. The smell of smoke still clung to the village, a lingering memory of the winter that had tested every fiber of human resilience. Marin's family stoked a small hearth, the flames smaller but no less comforting. Johann spoke quietly to Marin as they worked. "We survived what many thought impossible. Remember this: knowledge, courage, and unity saved us more than anything else. And yes, sometimes it took burning what others would scorn." Marin nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the night spent huddled near the pungent fire, the smell that had once repelled her now a symbol of survival. She had witnessed neighbors risking everything for others, children learning lessons in endurance, and the frailty of life pressed against the might of nature. Old Magda, the village healer, wandered past, smiling faintly. "The dung fire, it carried more than heat," she said. "It carried hope. Never forget that, child." The villagers began the painstaking work of replanting crops and rebuilding homes. Fields, frozen and barren for months, were now soft mud under the weak spring sun. Marin helped her family spread the last of the winter's manure across the fields, a final gift of warmth from the season's survival, a reminder that even waste could nourish life in unexpected ways. By midday, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden beams across the village. The wind had softened, the snow had begun to retreat, and life crept back into the bones of the earth. Children ran to explore the thawing fields, women hung wet blankets to dry, and men repaired fences and barns. Marin paused at the edge of the village, taking in the scene. Her heart swelled with a strange mix of relief and awe. The winter had been cruel beyond measure, but the villagers had endured. They had adapted, endured, and thrived, not because the world had been kind, but because they had refused to surrender. That evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Marin sat by the hearth, the last ember of the dung fire glowing faintly. She realized that survival was more than warmth, food, or shelter. It was community, knowledge, courage, and a willingness to embrace the unthinkable. The winter was over, but the lessons remained. Life, messy, pungent, and unpredictable, had a strange way of teaching resilience. And Marin knew, as she inhaled the lingering scent of smoke and earth, that humanity's spirit was as enduring as the harshest frost, and capable of finding hope in the most unlikely of places. Lessons from the fire. The snow had finally melted, leaving the village bathed in the weak, golden light of early spring. The air smelled of wet earth and the faint trace of smoke that lingered from the dung fires, an enduring reminder of the winter they had survived. The villagers moved with a quiet confidence now, hardened by months of frost, hunger, and the unthinkable acts they had embraced to endure. Marin walked through the streets, observing neighbors repairing huts, tending livestock, and preparing fields for planting. The memory of the bitter cold, the nights when the wind howled like a predator and the temperature plunged below -30°F, still lingered in her mind. Yet what remained strongest was not fear, but a profound respect for human ingenuity. Burning dung, once a source of disgust and shame, had been transformed into a lifeline. It had provided warmth when wood was scarce, created a communal rhythm of survival, and, paradoxically, fostered resilience and hope. The villagers had learned that survival demanded practicality over pride, ingenuity over superstition, and cooperation over isolation. Marin reflected on the lessons of that winter. 1. Ingenuity is survival. What seems wasteful or repulsive can become essential when necessity strikes. 2. Community is strength. Sharing knowledge, warmth, and resources turned individual struggle into collective triumph. 3. Resilience is learned. endurance is not just physical, but mental and moral, shaped by the challenges one faces. 4. Life thrives in unexpected forms. Even the most unglamorous tools, like dung, can carry life forward. The village elders spoke often of the winter, telling stories to the younger generation. Remember, Magda said one evening, "It is not the fire that saved us alone, but the courage to use it wisely, and the care we gave to each other." In the modern world, Marin knew, people might recoil at the idea of burning dung for warmth. But in the frozen reality of the Little Ice Age, it was brilliance born of necessity. It was a testament to human adaptability and survival instinct, lessons still relevant today. As the sun set, Marin sat by the hearth one final time, the fire now gentle and warm. Outside, the village hummed with life once more, a fragile harmony after months of struggle. And she understood, in a way that only those who had stared death in the face could, that the human spirit can turn even the most unlikely resources into salvation. The pungent smoke that once symbolized desperation now carried pride, endurance, and the quiet, extraordinary story of a people who survived when the world turned against them. And for Marin, and for her village, the winter had ended, but its lessons, like the embers of the fire, would never fade.